Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Principal Microsoft Technical Trainer. I'm excited to be your guide for Module 2, Implement Authentication by using the Microsoft Authentication Library. This is part of your identity module in the AZ-204 course. We are going to take a look at what the MSAL library is, and really the main goal of this is to get you into a lab to actually practice and prepare for this. This is going to cover a number of the topics that we've already introduced in a previous module, the Module 1 in this series. And we're going to now further that conversation about what is the conditional client apps that you're working with, how do you initialize the code, how do you register an app with the Microsoft Identity platforms themselves. So getting into the content, I want to go through this as relatively quickly as we can to get you into the lab, because that's the main point. If you haven't done Module 1 in this series, it's going to assume a lot of that information has been given to you, but I will cover very lightly some of the main concepts that we're going to cover in the exercise that's associated with this. In module number 1, we talked about what the authentication library is. It is this modern method of being able to authenticate using an OpenID, OAuth, WSFed, and these methods that are now industry standard. It's going to give you, through that authentication and authorization, give you access to something we'll cover in another module in this series, the Microsoft Graph, because while there is no security in the Microsoft Graph explicitly, the protections of the Microsoft Graph honor the authentication and authorizations coming from this model. So you don't have to apply different sets of securities through those APIs. They just enforce the authentications and authorizations that have already been granted as part of the MSAL library. So taking a look at these different features, whether you're building web applications, using web APIs, they talk about a number of different ways for us, but we've got different libraries across whatever platforms you want to use. They work with the authentication libraries to provide this authentication for you. We introduced in the introduction module a number of the different interactions in which your applications could now take this authentication. We've moved along from the monolithic model where you had a single identity applied to a monolithic application. We are now working with potentially microservices that now each have their own identity. And what happens if a user uses an application? What happens if a user uses an application that uses another application that tries to gain access to information? So all of these different features of, on behalf of, implicit grant, device codes. Some of you might have seen some of these capabilities as you're coming in, especially if you've got older devices that might not be able to integrate natively with this. Maybe you've got a streaming service provider that, you've got trying to get that streaming service, and it says, we need to authorize that device somehow by registering it with the authentication process to gain access to your streaming subscription. All of these are examples that you've probably seen examples of, but we have all of them play out in these different flows. And I talked about that previously. And if you take a look at these websites, all of these flows are talked about in depth. Go back up here at the top, that talks about the permissions, and specifically, here is the deeper dive into each of these topics that is going to explain what the flow is, what the impact is going to be, what is the challenge handshake that goes through. We talked about it in another recording that would say maybe you didn't need to authenticate for part of the application, but then that application is now trying to access specific information, and that information needs maybe a multi-factor authentication to say you weren't MFA'd initially when you came in using the application, but now the application doing an activity on your behalf needs to actually meet a conditional access to be able to grant you access to that information. So all of these different use cases are discussed in detail to meet your security requirements from your application development. We mentioned it doesn't matter what platform that you're working with, but this is an example of initializing the client application using the MSAL library. Looking at some of the capabilities of the MSAL library, dealing with the client application capabilities, we see that we have the full control that we've articulated or talked about in this series to be able to control the specific access you're going to need to say, do I need to override with a client ID? How does this all work for us? But all of those conditions are going to be met through the MSAL library. Let's get you into the lab where you're going to be able to implement this authentication and authorization model using your Microsoft Entra ID. You're going to use a .NET console specifically, a console application that you're going to deploy to implement a connection back to a Microsoft Graph capability. So let's get into the lab.
In this exercise, I'm going to register an application to Microsoft Entra ID and then create a .NET console application that uses the MSAL.NET to perform interactive authentication and acquire an access token for the Microsoft Graph. Let's get into it. I'm going to start with a new app registration. Put a name, keep the default values. Use my local host and register. So we've got the app registration. This is its identity and the directory for the tenant. I'll be using these values in my application, and I'll take a copy of them now and paste them into my code. I've gone into Visual Studio Code and I've opened up my project file. I'm going to start my .NET console. This is building the project files. I need to register a couple of packages, specifically Microsoft.identity.client and .env.net. So I'm going to get the values I need for my client ID and my tenant ID that I mentioned earlier. So I just grabbed those from the portal and I've pasted them in. The next thing I want to do is in my programs.cs file is get my application code in here. I've got my files all saved. So what I need to do now is run my application. I should get asked for an authentication for the application. There's my authentication. And I'll go back to Visual Studio. And you can see that I've acquired the access token. So that gets us to an end of the lab. Let's return back to the recording.
Welcome back from the lab. We're going to now close out this module with our knowledge check. So which MSAL library supports the single page web apps? Go ahead, pause the recording. That would be the MSAL.js that supports that web application or single page application that you're dealing with. Question number 2, what is the purpose of using the public client application builder class in the MSAL.net? Go ahead and pause the recording. Okay. That class is used to build out the authorization content for the interactive authentication in the console application that you've built. So that brings us to the end of module number 2, where there wasn't much new content. This built significantly on previously taught topics around the modern authentication model and the MSAL library, where it fits in, how it's modified from previous versions. This was really about actually getting in and implementing a solution that calls the MSAL library, providing these new modern authentication models. And so what it allows you to now implement is that modern model of identity being the new perimeter of security. And identity now is not just defined as a user, it's the applications themselves that now have their own identities. And we can now implement that level of security that regardless of what the user brings to the application, we can now enforce a level of security at the application level that could potentially supersede what the user brings, and so that you're not going to have an over provision or over sharing of information. So thank you for joining me on this journey, and we look forward to seeing you in another recording.